Launching. Okay, I think we're live for the webinar. Yeah, no, so you were talking about the book and the cover, and that I think, my two favorite things about the book, like the physical book, are there's no dust jacket. I've always hated a dust jacket. I don't know about you guys, but I just immediately throw them away, and then I don't get to see the cover art that somebody might have put some thought into, So this is just like, it's like baked in, which is nice.
Yeah, I don't know what happens to the covers. They're always falling off and everything.
Yeah, unless you're like a librarian and you tape them into place or something.
Did you get to choose did you design that cover, or did you get to choose it, or how did that go?
It's a panel from a comic by Joe Sacco, who's like a comic journalist.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote this book. It's not a graphic novel because it's nonfiction, but he wrote a comic called The Fixer, actually, some years back, about the guy he had worked with when he was in Sarajevo, kind of right after the war.
Right.
And so this is actually like, he was nice enough to let me use a panel from it, where wait, let me move my head. So that's the author, like in the corner as the reporter. So yeah, and I like that it captures kind of the, I don't know, ambiguity of the whole relationship.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great, because one of the biggest sort of arm wrestles that happens in the publishing industry is between the author and the publisher over the cover. Very few authors are happy with the cover on their books. In my experience, yeah.
Noah's a pretty unique author too, because he literally arm wrestles them, right, Noah?
Maybe that's why you got your way.
That usually kills on when the panels are live,
Yeah, well, the also a good arm wrestling, a good negotiating tactic is to give them free stuff to use, I think, and not ask them to purchase something new. So
right.
Yeah, no, I was super lucky. Actually, there was, I guess, a fixer of sorts. A friend of mine, a journalist in India, Naresh Fernandez, knew him and put us in touch. So then, because we had that, like, that go-between, he just allowed me to use it for free. So I think, yeah, we had to pay market price for a Joe Sacco original. It might not have been as easy to sell.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I got stuck with a stock photo that looked like prison labor. It was about a book about older workers, and there was a woman who really looked like she was at a some sort of a labor camp or something.
Huh.
I don't know, and then I had no input, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, I don't know. So I guess we're 5 past. You want to get started? Take it away, Koji.
Sure. Yeah, we can get started. Sort of interesting because you can't really see the attendees. I guess you just sort of know that they're out there in the world. Okay, so let's get started here. So first of all, I'd just like to welcome everyone who's in attendance to the book launch of Fixing Stories, Local Newsmaking and International Media in Turkey and Syria. So I wanted to give a special thanks to the Media School, Hamilton Lugal School, and the Department of Sociology at IU for supporting this event. So my name is Koji Chavez. I'm an assistant professor in the sociology department at IU. I specialize in workplace inequalities and so forth. And I had the pleasure to read an earlier version of Noah's book, which I'm going to talk about more in just a moment. So I want to introduce Noah Arjomand, our author here. So Noah is the Helmick postdoctoral scholar in global media, development, and democracy at the Lugar School. He is a sociologist by training, as well as a documentary filmmaker. And as a side note, I had the pleasure of seeing his movie, Eat Your Catfish, and it's absolutely outstanding. And it is premiering at the Santa Barbara Film Festival next week. And I'm really excited for the US premiere. But that's beside the point. I think it's just Noah's a person of many talents. But let's talk about his book. So Noah spent 3 years doing field research with support from the National Science Foundation for his book, Fixing Stories, which explores the world of local fixers in Turkey and Syria. In journalism, a fixer is a local guide and interpreter who helps foreign reporters with translation, access to sources, safety and logistics, and generally in making sense of the people and places they are reporting. As I said, I had the pleasure to read an earlier draft of this book, and I was completely blown away by Noah's ability to tell a story, the writing, the insights that he was communicating. I was really blown away. I was reminded of being a first or second year in grad school and reading, one of those great qualitative books. The one that comes to mind is Lamont's Dignity of Working Men that I read. It just blew me away. I had the same feeling reading the earlier draft of Noah's book. And so I'm really excited that it came out. So Joseph Coleman will help us kick off our conversation about fixing stories. Joe is a professor of practice at the media school. Before coming to IU, he had worked for 2 decades as a correspondent covering Latin America, Europe, and Asia. So Noah and I are excited to hear his thoughts and questions as an insider to the world of international journalism. First, though, Noah will read an excerpt from his book. While Noah reads and responds to the first few questions from Joe and me, feel free to write down any questions you have in the Q&A box. At least on my screen, there's a little option at the bottom that says Q&A. If you have a question, anytime during the presentation or anytime during the Q&A section, just type it in there and I will, I'll be able to ask it to Noah as the event goes on. So I will give it up to Noah.
All right, well, thanks so much, Koji, for the kind introduction and also for plugging my film. Coming to IU, in fact, those of you who are joining from Bloomington at the end of April. But yeah, today is about the book, not the film. So I'm gonna start off by reading a passage here. And this is actually kind of from the middle of the book. So, before I get started, I should actually kind of note that the main character who you're going to hear featured in this excerpt, Elif, is actually a composite character. So the book kind of centers around a series of narratives of fixers' careers, which are, empirically grounded. They're based on interviews, on observations of reporters and fixers at work, and also on my own experiences. So for this project, I worked myself kind of both as a reporter, and I would hire, a couple different fixers to help me with the story, and then see how they led me in different directions potentially. And then also as a fixer, I worked as a fixer myself. So then when I came to writing the book, I actually ended up, I created kind of a series of composite characters, and Elif is one of those. And I did this for a few reasons, but the most important of those was really to protect the identities of people who participated in my study and, who were generous enough to give me their time and to open up to me about often very sensitive professional, personal, and also political matters. And, so this particular passage that I'm going to read is kind of like relatively tame, but elsewhere in the book, I do talk, I kind of record people saying and doing things that could get them in pretty serious trouble, both like with their colleagues and with their employers, and even more seriously with the Turkish government or with armed groups in Syria. So, just to give you that warning before I jump into it, that Elif is actually a composite character. And, in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about kind of how I did that exactly a bit, but let me jump right in with this passage. A year into her fixing career, Elif guiltily felt like it was her job to use people, to subject them to journalist interrogations and dehumanize them as mere bits of information. She felt exploitative in a general way when pressuring strangers into talking with their clients, but experienced a particularly knotted anxiety when introducing foreign reporters to people she knew and cared for. Elif's moral qualms coincided with practical concerns about precious social capital. A person's social capital consists of their ties to others that can be used for professional or personal ends. There's little social cost to a fixer in bothering or alienating a stranger on the street. I mean, strangers are in plentiful supply, and the fixer has not invested time or effort into building ties with them. Pressuring an acquaintance into contributing to her story, however, put social capital at risk. To reduce her dependence on friends and family, to increase the likelihood that she had a contact at the ready who could satisfy any client's prescription, Elif hustled to expand her social network. Whether she was rolling out her yoga mat before a class or sipping wine and half listening to an artist friend's critique at a gallery opening, Elif was on the lookout. When she did find a prospective source, her approach mirrored a romantic seduction. Appear interested but not desperate, hint at offering something they want without vulgar transactionalism, get their phone number. The downside to her vigilance, Elif felt, was that she increasingly thought of people as sources of information. Friends were turning into contacts. Her ears perked up at the mention of a potentially valuable source, and she could never quite turn off that objectifying gaze, even when she was not working on a story. Elif was ambivalently caught between two ways of considering others, as whole people or as information packets. As the strength of Elif's ties to these new clients grew, these new contacts grew, so too did her anxieties over introducing them to client reporters. The norms of friendship increasingly tugged on her. Even if she first met someone in the course of reporting, they might go from source to friend. She might begin to feel protective of them. Convincing a source that participation is worthwhile, only to have a reporter fail to engage, is a risk that fixers learn to consider when matchmaking. Elif's clients would sometimes ask her to contact a prospective source, but then not follow through because they changed their mind or mismanaged their schedule or decided they already had enough material for the story. When this happened, Elif felt cheated. She called in a favor, perhaps convinced the source that they would benefit from the coverage, only for the reporter to fail to uphold their end of a bargain she had so painstakingly brokered. Foreign reporters more readily cancel interviews than fixers because the former have less invested of their own effort and social capital into the pre-production work of finding and seducing sources. Worse yet, some clients offended sources or exploited them. One of Elif's clients, Chad, had never been to Turkey, but reported on the whole world remotely from the United States. Elif would connect him with English-speaking sources to interview via telephone or Skype. I don't think he really knows how to empathize with people, Elif told me. It's a very awkward conversation. Chad asked obtuse, insensitive questions, and his personal social awkwardness was enhanced by his physical and moral distance from sources. Chad lived in a very different world from sources and was not exposed to the sights, sounds, and smells any reporter on the ground confronts in the course of living in a country and traveling to meet sources. Such sensory data provide reporters with a more nuanced understanding of the world of the source and bring the former into greater alignment with locals, at least at the basic level of shared perception of what is happening around them. The physical distance between Chad and sources also meant that they depended on unreliable communication technology, whose spotty and often desynchronized audio served to exacerbate misunderstandings and micro-level breaches of coding and rhythmic norms of conversation. In one instance, Chad did not log on to Skype for an interview with a source in Diyarbakir who waited for him to call amid violent clashes between protesters and police. In the end, Elif told the source, "Never mind, let's cancel, go home and stay safe." In other cases, the way Chad conducted interviews or wrote stories drew the ire of sources. Chad's actions degraded the value of Elif's word in vouchsafing future clients to those sources. After one interview, I was like, I really don't want to give contacts to someone who I don't know to be a decent interview, because this Chad guy, like, oh my God, I want to punch him. Elif also adopted the strategy of inserting herself as a buffer between Chad and sensitive or valuable sources in order to limit the damage he could do. When it came to the best friend of the victim of a terrorist bombing, for example, Elif neglected to inform Chad that the girl could speak English. That way, Elif was the one who conducted the phone interview, providing a selective translation of responses for Chad's write-up of the story. I'm so glad he didn't speak to that girl because we both needed a very soft conversation. Like, I wasn't asking questions. She was just talking and I was just, listening. If it were like questions, I think she would have freaked out. The moral dimension of protecting sources cannot be reduced to immediate concerns for social capital. That girl would not likely be a valuable source of information for future stories. Rather, at least broader moral disposition induced feelings of protectiveness. Like anyone living in Turkey at the time, Elise feared that she or a loved one would be among the random victims of one of the increasingly frequent terrorism attacks rocking the country. She could imagine herself in the girl's shoes, but thought Chad, safe at his home office in America, lacked this capacity. Okay, I'll leave it at that for now.
Terrific. Noah, thank you for inviting me to have this conversation with you. It's a fascinating look at the sort of this kind of insider relationship in international reporting that really gets glossed over in many ways, because in the journalist narrative, the journalist is at the center of the action typically, right? And fixers are sort of these anonymous side characters who engineer the feats of journalism that the journalist performs. So in many publications, the fixers are anonymous. They don't appear at all. Many times, in fact, as I've used fixers, and there was no consciousness on my part or my editor's part, or perhaps even on the fixer's part, that I would cite the fixers in some way, unless they had directly contributed information. But if I said, hey, I need to talk to a member of parliament in Mongolia, and the fixer set it up, and then I went and interviewed the parliamentarian, and the fixer didn't enter into my calculations as someone who was someone who should be cited in the story. It was a part of the sort of the way that the salami was produced, that doesn't go noted in by the audience necessarily. So I have sort of just a question about how you came to this particular subject. I mean, what fascinated you about this relationship? At what point did you realize that this relationship was something interesting and worth digging into? And where are you coming from that you ended up writing this book?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks again, Joe, so much for your comments, and it's amazing to have an experienced reporter who knows this relationship and what it's like very well. To be kind of as my interlocutor for this. Yeah. So as far as the origin of the story, I mean, I think probably at some level, deep down, I was very interested in this question of kind of people who are like bridges between different cultural worlds and so on. Kind of by virtue of being my father's from Iran, and then I started studying Turkish and Persian in college, and spending a lot of time in the Middle East, and kind of being in this position as an Iranian American, of being not quite an insider and not quite an outsider. And then I saw also other people I would come across, pulling off that act much better than I was, So I think, jealousy was probably some part of the motivation for this study. And then it was actually in Afghanistan. So early in my graduate studies, I thought I was going to work on Afghanistan, and kind of I wasn't thinking anything about fixtures. I was thinking about like the international, developments and counterinsurgency projects and so on. But as I was doing research, particularly for research for this one report, which was about like a hydroelectric dam project in southern Afghanistan, it really occurred to me that a lot of the kind of most interesting, insightful, knowledgeable people who I was coming across were people who were kind of playing this role, or an analogous role maybe in other kind of fields. So, they don't call them fixers, but there are similar people, of course, in, working for embassies, working for NGOs, working for private companies who, whenever there's a gap in understanding, in ability to communicate, in ability to get access, you're always going to find these kind of intermediaries often playing a similarly kind of behind the scenes role, you know, for in some cases for their own protection, or also because they're kind of easy to overlook, and because kind of their existence often, you know, as you were getting it, can kind of interfere with people's claims to be really understanding what's going on. You know, so if you're working for, I don't know, the State Department or an NGO, you don't necessarily want to highlight that all of your information is coming through these intermediaries, and you're, you know, sitting behind glass walls in Kabul and never actually see the projects that you're, you know, claiming are going so well in Afghanistan. So, you know, I want to do this project, some version of this project, and news fixers are interesting because they're almost kind of, in a way, the purest form of the information broker, because, right, what journalists are producing ultimately is information, is kind of stories about the world, and, you know, ultimately kind of the final products that they're working on become something publicly available. So that you know, which also kind of makes researching them a bit easier, you know, in terms of you can actually see what they, you know, the fruits of their labor, and they're relatively easier to access, you know, than people who have security clearances working for embassies or military translators or anything like this. So yeah, you know, and I also kind of had a long running interest in journalism, and had kind of dabbled as a journalist myself. Ultimately, then it was in 2014, I thought I was going to start this research in Afghanistan. And this was at a moment, it was right after a presidential election, and there was kind of a deadlocked politics, and it seemed like there might be, you know, an even worse version of the civil war breaking out at any minute. So I ultimately thought, you know, maybe I should do this research in Turkey instead, both, you know, for my own safety, and also because there was a much greater variety of news coming out of Turkey at the time, that, you know, it wasn't all just the story of war in one way or another that, you know, that was coming out of Afghanistan. So by doing it in Turkey, I could also, you know, kind of look at cultural reporting and economic reporting, and how reporting on Syria, for example, differed from reporting on Turkey, because by the time I was there, the Syrian civil war was raging, and already by 2014, I think when I first started, it wasn't public knowledge yet that ISIS was kidnapping and killing reporters. They hadn't, you know, published some of these gory videos yet, but news was, foreign news agencies were pulling their reporters out, and more reporting was happening actually remotely from Turkey, reporting on Syria. So for that reason, it made a very good place to study. And so, you know, and then overall, I guess, and I talk about this in the book, you know, I'd also had my own versions of kind of working with and through fixers, and often, yeah, those seem like the most interesting people often to talk to. So I thought, you know, why not go and study them as the main characters for once, where usually they're kind of the either invisible or kind of playing a sidekick or side character role.
Yeah, yeah. We've got one question in. Shall I ask from the audience? In general, would you say one becomes a fixer by actively seeking out the role, or do they stumble into it? That's a good question.
Yeah, definitely the latter. Good question. Yeah, there's no, you know, there's no fixing track in journalism schools that I know of. People don't, grow up telling their parents that they want to be fixers when they grow up. It overwhelmingly, it ends up being what kind of feels almost like these like serendipitous, you know, meet cutes with the first journalist who they run into. Of course, there's a pattern to who becomes a journalist, to who becomes a fixer, like who has the right, you know, cross-cultural skills, the right language skills, the right position in social networks to be useful as a people finder. So it's not random, but it can often feel random, I think, to people, that it's like, oh, you know, I had this friend and foreigner, and then their friend came into town and needed somebody to work with. So I didn't even know what fixing was, but they said, I'll pay you $50 a day to help me translate. And then they kind of, for various reasons, often fine. And sometimes the reason is they're excited to work with foreigners, and kind of the exotic excitement for them is actually of working with these, foreign journalists. For other people like Elif, who I mentioned in the book, the thrill ends up being like, it kind of gives them, a license to be almost socially transgressive in like talking to people who normally they wouldn't be able to talk to or wouldn't have opportunity to or something. So, for various reasons, people stumble into it. And then in the case of Turkey, tons of actually professional career journalists who work for the Turkish media end up kind of falling into fixing, because the Turkish government has been progressively taking over all of the independent and critical and opposition news outlets in the country. So, there are a lot of people in Turkey who find they can't do the kind of reporting they'd want to do anymore, because, their newspaper or their TV station got bought up by a businessman who, is closely tied to the president. And so they find kind of then, they've maybe met in the course of reporting at press conferences and so on. They've met some foreign reporters, and then they realize that they can earn a decent living, sometimes even a better living than they were, assisting the foreign press, and often in ways where they feel that it's at least more kind of honest, or it's more real journalism than they'd be able to do working for kind of a pro-government propaganda outlet in Turkey.
I was going to say, sorry.
Go right ahead, Koji.
There was another question that actually is a really good segue based on what you were talking about. You're basically saying there's different avenues into getting into fixing, and one audience member asked whether you see any differences essentially between people who might be local reporters on the from those countries and they turn out to be fixers versus just local people, whether you see any differences between the two and how they sort of influence the story.
Yeah, great question. And I think we can position, we're kind of talking about like insiders and outsiders, fixers being to some extent the insiders, at least relative to their clients. But I think among fixers also, there's kind of a spectrum from people who are more insiders, who are like kind of recruited, maybe they're a refugee in a camp and they happen to speak English because they were an English teacher or something, and a journalist comes over along and they're bored out of their skull doing nothing in a refugee camp and want something to do. And I think a surprising number of people become fixers out of boredom, or they're trying to earn a living to survive, and then they end up kind of being mostly valuable because like they can introduce the journalists to people they know personally, like their families might be of interest to journalists, their particular social networks. And you see this also, for example, with fixers who are covering kind of more difficult to access issues like, smuggling, organized crime, things like this. They often are people who have earned, and for some reason or another, or in some kind of a reciprocal relationship with the sources who are of interest. So kind of people who are more insiders to the sources. Then often the case, I think, for people who have a career as professional journalists and then enter fixing, is that they're a little bit more, they're kind of insiders to journalism, but outsiders a bit more to the worlds that they're covering. So, often, and then that affects kind of how they're maybe useful to reporters in some ways. Like, somebody who has had years as a reporter will perhaps have a lot better of kind of a sense of what's newsworthy, what's an interesting story. And they might also have a better sense of like what their client understands, what needs to be explained to them in straightforward terms, what can be left as subtext, and so on. So they might have more kind of experience in this like kind of transcoding local realities into something a reporter can make sense of. But maybe they're a little bit less connected. They're a little bit less kind of useful on the access side of things.
No, I was wondering, I'm very interested in this. I mean, you alluded to it in the part of the book that you read earlier. I guess breaking this off into two pieces, there's a relationship between the reporter and the fixer, and then there's this influence on coverage. And I'd like to focus on the relationship first, like how, I guess, presumably they ran the gamut, but I mean, how was that in this case? I mean, the fixer had her foibles in that segment, but the reporter, of course, did not come off very very well at all. So I'm wondering, how you must have seen relationships that were better than that. I mean, how did it? What was the spectrum of these relationships?
Yeah, I mean, this in some ways was kind of this Chad guy. This was a bit of an extreme case because he didn't even come to Turkey, right? So he was a very extreme outsider. And what that meant was that it was more dangerous to kind of introduce him to sources. And also he wasn't necessarily asking questions that Elif herself found interesting, and also Elif kind of didn't have much sway over him because they were in this very kind of transactional relationship of you find me a person to interview. Whereas in a lot of cases, including for Elif, with ultimately other clients who she ended up working on with more closely, it becomes much more of almost kind of a mutual apprenticeship where often a fixer is kind of learning about the ways of international journalism, and in some cases it can be kind of at a technical level of learning how to do shoot video clips and how to create a TV package and stuff like this, how to use those satellite bands to transmit information back, this kind of thing. And more broadly, kind of learning journalism, learning the journalism perspective, what's newsworthy and what isn't. Some people would complain their fixers or their translators would tell them oh, I've got this really interesting story. Two people got married in my village, and that nobody cares about that in America. You have to figure out a way. Maybe there is some angle, but you have to figure out a way to package it in a way that kind of our editors at least will think that American audiences, or which are audience abroad, will care about that. So there's kind of at best fixers are kind of learning how to be journalists while still maintaining a sensitivity to local realities and perspectives. And then also the reporters are apprentices themselves because they're learning and curious and open to changing their perspective about what's going on in the country, and we all unavoidably are, biased and selective, and we're kind of applying our own frameworks of understanding onto issues and to things in the world that don't really actually conform to those frameworks. But I think what ends up working best in terms of the news that's produced, and also in terms of reporter-fixer relationships, are when reporters are more open to being contradicted and kind of more open to grappling with the messy realities of the world that don't necessarily conform to the mainstream narratives that they've been reading. Because otherwise there's this danger of kind of the meta narrative, the kind of overarching assumptions kind of overwhelming the realities of what's happening, and that's where fixers often get to feel really disillusioned with their work, that they're not actually making a difference or kind of even getting through to their clients, but it's just kind of this fill in the blank kind of model of journalism.
So we have a couple questions from the audience, and I'm going to sort of combine two together because I think they're related. And it seems like people are really interested in the consequences for the fixers themselves. And I know you spent some time as a fixer, right? So I guess there's two parts. One is, as a fixer, what kinds of, are you exposed to danger? What's the day in the life of a fixer? I think people are interested in just hearing what that would be like. And the second part is, you've spent time as a fixer, you've met a lot of fixers. Were there any consequences that they perhaps didn't anticipate in being a fixer? Maybe if they wanted to get out of the industry, were there some unexpected consequences of being a fixer for a news organization?
Yeah, luckily I didn't get into trouble or face much danger in my own brief fixing career. But yeah, certainly, especially I'd say, especially Syrian fixers and especially Kurdish fixers or fixers working on Kurdish issues in Eastern Turkey face a lot of danger. And that was just kind of a very routine part of their work and their calculation on, how to communicate with reporters and where to go and so on, was factoring in safety, and so, like for example, for one character, Noor, in my book, where I talked about, who's Kurdish, reporting on Eastern Turkey, where by the way, there's been since the mid 1980s like a kind of continuous, if slow burning, insurgency by Kurdish separatists. This is the PKK against the Turkish state. So a pretty routine part of her job would be to go to these Kurdish movement protests, which were generally put down violently by police, and it was up to her to know, for example, where to position her crew or her reporter she was working with. And so what this often meant would be you don't want to show the police that you're on the protester side by going over with them. You don't want the protesters to think that you're with the police. So where you end up standing is right in the middle, and then you've got bricks flying in one direction from the protesters toward the police, and tear gas canisters and paintballs rounds flying in the other direction. So just a very concrete illustration of how being in the middle can be quite dangerous, right? And so what Noor had to face, and especially what Syrian fixers had to face also, was accusations of being spies. And in a lot of places, journalists foreign reporters are assumed to be in one way or another representing the countries that they're from or the governments of those countries, with varying degrees of nefariousness. And so, fixers very much have to worry about how they're presenting themselves, about where they go or who they trust, because also, especially in Syria, journalists and especially foreign journalists became currency, right? For their particularly European governments were willing to pay millions of dollars for their release, and so militia groups would kidnap them, and ISIS would murder them, but other groups would kidnap them and hold them for ransom. And I tell the story of one fixer who goes through that, who's abducted in Aleppo with his clients. And in that case, he it's a double-edged sword being a fixer and this kind of behind the scenes person, and that you're maybe not as valued as a commodity as your foreign reporters, your foreign clients, but also nobody necessarily has your back. You might not have an official contract with the news organization. They might not do anything to protect you. The foreign governments that are paying a big ransom, you might not even come up. And as far as I know, the character who I talk about never came up even in these negotiations for the release of his clients. So I think fixers absolutely need to worry about safety. And again, because they're in kind of this ambiguous role, their relationship with news organizations are ambiguous. They have to worry about not getting as much protection. And then they also have to worry and be very careful about kind of the way that they're seen as being affiliated with foreigners.
Terrific. So I guess the other side of the coin is, as far as the relationship between reporter and fixer, and the dangers that fixers often encounter, and the responsibilities too that they assume in helping the reporters with their own security needs. How does all this sort of affect the journalism that comes out of this at the end?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked that, because this is kind of really precisely the point that I'm hoping to kind of progressively build toward in the book, is that fixers, even though they're generally not the official authors of news pieces, affect them incredibly deeply because their strategies for managing danger and risk and also managing threats to social capital that we saw, for example, and managing their long-term relationships with reporters and with sources, those strategies for managing relationships are also simultaneously ways in which they transform the information that's flowing from source to reporter. So, part 4 of the book, called Translations, is looking at this really kind of all the way down to the micro level of like how fixers choose the right word when they're doing simultaneous or consecutive translation, how that shapes a reporter's understanding of what's going on, or if a fixer fails, how that can even kind of lead to a breakdown in communication where news doesn't get made about something potentially, important and relevant. And then, that kind of what holds true at the micro level, I think also holds true at kind of larger levels, that, fixers' choices for matchmaking sources with reporters absolutely change the story. A reporter might say, find me a member of the opposition. I talked to one person who would work as a fixer and had precisely this experience, that it was kind of a very broad, vague request from their client. And in fact, this fixer was like Turkish Canadian, much more of kind of on the outsider side of the spectrum, didn't really know what the local political scene very well. And so he found his client somebody who was from like this very left-wing / fascist, fringy, the Vatan Partisi, for those of you who know Turkish politics, person to interview as, a representative of the opposition. Now, there are lots of different opposition figures in Turkey, and it of course makes a massive difference to a lot of them, like if they're getting seen, legitimized in international press coverage and so on. And it makes a huge difference for kind of from the any kind of a local perspective on the reporting. But yet, for this reporter, this extremist guy was kind of interchangeable in a certain way with somebody from a more like the mainstream opposition. And so like fixers' choices of how they matchmake clients and sources, which again tend to be based on the limits of their own knowledge and also their own social networks, and also their considerations for risk, for protecting valuable sources and so on. All of that goes to shaping like whose voices appear, and that can make a huge difference if you're if you're a faction in the Syrian civil war, whether you get painted as heroic opposition or a terrorist group or not mentioned at all, makes a big difference for your prospects in attracting money and recruits and all of this kind of stuff. So it's kind of often at this level where reporters might not even realize the intervention that fixers are making, but it does make a profound difference locally. That's really kind of where you see fixers making a huge difference, I think, in kind of shaping stories. And then kind of also connected to the earlier questions about like fixer-journalist relationships, fixers also make a big difference in that they change reporters' perspectives. And often when it is a close long-term relationships, reporters might come to a country thinking one thing and then think something completely different. And the biggest influence on them is generally going to be the fixer who they're working with every day and having arguments about politics with every day, even on the side of their reporting, and who's also kind of giving them the background knowledge and the context about what their sources are telling them that can, ideally lead them to kind of adjust their viewpoints, or less ideally turn them into propagandists for one particular local faction or another, whether they realize that or not.
It's almost like the fixer is the anonymous source, and it in the story, that's fascinating.
Yeah, kind of anonymous meta source almost. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So we have a couple of questions coming in from the audience. I wanted you to quickly address one question because I think it's related to what you just mentioned. It's about the role of fixers in the news production process itself. And one of the attendees asked whether fixers should be credited for articles. And I was just wondering, what are the advantages or disadvantages of doing that? And secondly, is that something that fixers talk about or care about even Yeah, if you could just address that.
Yeah, good question. And it's definitely something that comes up. I mean, it's also kind of begs the even more fundamental question about like who exactly is a fixer versus a reporter or versus a producer or versus a translator, where, you know, you'd maybe think that, okay, if somebody's kind of performing a mechanical task like translation, they shouldn't be credited as the author. I don't know if somebody's at the producer level, you know, in practice, they're, at least with, you know, TV, they're more likely to get credited. But these things aren't always obvious, and it can also kind of be blurry about like, is this person just translating, or are they kind of, where does translation end and authorship begin can be a tricky question, you know, and it's always going to be a kind of a negotiation that's made on pretty unequal terms, because, you know, the reporter has, and their editor has a lot more power to say who gets credited and who doesn't. But there's often kind of a negotiation about credit, and, you know, fixers can feel slighted that, you know, oh, on this particular story, I did all the reporting. I even, you know, I interviewed the source and just sent quotations to this guy, you know, maybe it's Chad or whoever, and he just kind of added some connective tissue between sentences I had crafted, or, you know, information that I had gathered, and then so why does he get all the credit and I get none? But in other cases, and you know, as I think we've been alluding to, credit can also be dangerous, or, you know, being officially affiliated with foreign news organizations can be dangerous. And so there are often times when fixers, you know, don't want their name on a story, either because they don't believe in it, or because they do really believe in it, but they need to protect themselves. And you know, foreign reporters, at least in Turkey, as much as the Turkish government has kind of taken on a hardline, you know, nationalist stance against, you know, foreign fake news and all this stuff, foreign reporters do still enjoy relative impunity from the government. You know, at a time when Turkey has been, for the last decade, kind of on and off the worst jailer of journalists in the world. You know, so if you report something for the domestic media, criticizing the president, or, you know, doing any number of things, you might get thrown in jail, or at least kind of dragged through court endlessly. But that doesn't really happen to fixers so much, and particularly fixers who aren't getting officially credited, and who, in a sense, kind of are able to maintain like plausible deniability. And, you know, if a source calls them up angrily about a story, they can join them in, you know, trash talking the reporter and saying, you know, oh, I just, you know, did basic translation for this person, and I can't believe what they did with the story. So there can be kind of advantages also to anonymity, or being able to, you know, play both sides and so on, which comes with being relatively invisible in the newsmaking process.
That's great. So we actually have a few, unless Joe, do you have a question? So we have a few questions about the research design, because we're academics and so people are interested, I think. So one of the attendants said that you said Alif was a composite character. Can you explain your methodology for combining several research subjects into a single character for the book? And just a clarification, like, are these fictionalized narratives or only fictionalized characters? So just a little bit of the rationale behind the methodological choice that you made.
Yeah. So it's kind of, let's say, real data and real, you know, situations and so on, not fictionalized, but then kind of remixed to create composite characters in a way that protected their anonymity. Now, what you mean by real data also, you know, gets complicated, because, of course, when you put two pieces of data together, then you're telling a new story. So is that truthful anymore? It can be tough to know. And of course, this is kind of a problem that anybody who's telling a story kind of has to face. Of, you know, you can be cherry picking information in a way that ultimately is misleading or leaving out some context. And I think that's true for journalists as much as it is for social scientists. But yeah, really kind of the danger, I guess, with particularly with kind of creating composite characters, is that it almost like widens the pool of available data that you have, so that you can maybe even be much freer in like cherry picking in order to tell a story that conforms to your own like theoretical assumptions or, you know, frameworks for understanding it. So like there's maybe even more danger when you're fictionalizing in this way of like kind of even doing violence to the people who are participating in your study, or like misrepresenting them, or kind of telling, just the story that conforms to what you wanted to tell to begin with, in which case, why even bother to go and do research? Just write a novel in that case. So the method that I came up with, so I have an appendix of the book actually, where I kind of go into detail about like the kind of technical side of this and how it fits into other, like, kind of, it draws on other social science methods like qualitative comparative analysis and sequence analysis and so on. So for the technically minded, check out the appendix. But in a nutshell, like basically what I tried to do was come up with a method where, instead of fictionalizing, allowing me to get away with just, telling a story that conformed to my assumptions, instead, it created a process where, while writing, I was constantly like challenging myself and my own assumptions and trying to come up with new refined theories based on based on the similarities and differences that I was seeing between people who I was combining into a composite. So, my composites were based on people who I inferred were similar to each other in some ways. So I tried to create a writing process where I was systematically thinking through, okay, what makes this person who, this real person in the world, similar to this other real person and different from this other real person? And then folding that into my idea of like the different varieties of fixers, and kind of so actually some of these ideas about like fixers being kind of located along the spectrum from insiders to outsiders, for example, was something that I kind of came up with in the process of my writing and in the process of creating these composite characters who I would argue were kind of also constructed in a way that kind of united people who were similar in some key ways, whether in terms of their professional experience before this, whether they were reporters for the domestic press before this, but also in terms of the way that they went about fixing.
Okay, great. I wanted to get in a question about, okay, so what do we do with this information? I guess, are there any ways that we can improve the relationship between fixers and journalists, or improve the way that we use fixers, for lack of a better word, the way we employ fixers? Is there any way we can improve that so that the journalism that comes out of it is better, more higher quality?
Yeah. I mean, I think things are already kind of moving in a better direction in journalism. That there's been a bit more kind of critical self-awareness on the parts of a lot of journalists about the ways that this can kind of build inequality into the process, and a lot of critiques also from people who are often of hyphenated nationalities, or who are now being able to rise as the system of international journalism is becoming less kind of colonialist, into the ranks, up through the ranks. So, and you do see this, like a lot of people who are now correspondents for countries began as fixers, and they're now, they have been able to rise through the ranks. There isn't just, a super, as much of a super racist kind of system of like only white guys can tell the news with authority, and everybody else is at best a helper to them. So that system is changing, and then those people are, I think, often, well, some of them are worried about the people who are a status threat to them, who are now in lower ranks, but others of them are kind of raising their voices about fairness in terms of just at the basic level of like who gets a flak jacket and a helmet. If it's dangerous enough that a reporter can get shot, surely it's dangerous enough that a fixer can also get shot. So I think there's already like work being done in journalism in this direction. I'm not sure about kind of vast structural changes that can happen. In terms of structural changes, it's tough to realistically propose anything in journalism right now when it's a profession that's, you know, starved for money and trying to rethink its basic business models and stuff like this. And so, you know, any solution that involves like, oh, you should give fixers, you know, health insurance and benefits, probably is going to fall on deaf ears. But kind of at the individual level of, you know, hopefully there are people in this audience and people who will read the book who are involved in journalism. You know, I think that just kind of this critical self-awareness of the way that we need to kind of puncture the myth of this lone intrepid reporter out there in the world, and not reliant on anybody. I think we need to puncture that myth and, you know, stop reinforcing it by erasing the labor of the people working with us, and instead kind of hopefully embrace a more collaborative spirit to journalism, and both in the actual making of it and who you're willing to listen to, and also in terms of who you're willing to give credit when they want it. And yeah, then, you know, I think it's not a very activisty, you know, book with like prescriptions for what to do, in part because I think that like whenever you have a system where people are involved in pretty dangerous interactions with each other, and where there are kind of gaps in cultural understanding, there's inevitably going to be these kind of invisible brokers who appear and play a role. But yeah, so I think, you know, kind of if there's an intervention of the book, it's at this level of hopefully raising people's kind of critical self-awareness, and I guess also awareness of people reading the news about how it's actually constructed in practice.
So I have one sort of final question here, which is sort of a nice, you know, sort of a question to tie it all up. But what would you say is the main takeaway that you want readers to leave with after finishing your book? And as they say in NPR, you have 30 seconds. No, I'm just kidding. You have like 2 minutes.
Yeah, main takeaway. Well, I guess it's that, I mean, at the most basic level, fixers exist and shape the news in significant ways. And the biggest takeaway, I suppose, is kind of fitting that argument into the larger picture of how news gets produced and consumed, where, you know, we shouldn't think of news as ever representing in some straightforward way a single perspective or, you know, a single set of interests. Where, you know, of course, you know, ideas do follow money to some extent, and it matters who owns it, you know, media publications and so on. But we should instead, I think, view the news always as kind of this series of unequal negotiations between a whole chain of brokers stretching from where a story first exists, where something first happens, all the way to, you know, your computer screen or TV set or whatever. And so, you know, always to kind of adopt a maybe more honest view of journalism as something that's always the product of these kind of tentative, partial negotiations, and not as either, you know, straightforwardly like fake and serving, you know, the Illuminati or whoever, or the word of God because it's created by some objective journalist out there who we should just trust.
Well, no, I'd like to thank you for you know, sharing so much information about your book. I'm really excited to see it in hardcover. Again, I read the earlier version. I'm so excited to see the final version. Joseph, thank you so much for all of the questions, and thank you for everyone in the audience for providing so many insightful questions here. And I really enjoyed this conversation. This was great. And I'm really excited. So yeah, congratulations on the book. I guess if we were all in the room, we could clap. I'm not sure what we're supposed to do virtually, but you can clap in your offices if anyone's listening.
All right.
Oh
yeah. Well, thank you. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, I meant to clap and I hit the wrong thing.
Yeah, you had a raised hand there. So,
yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Joe, Koji, and also to the Hamilton Lugar School, Department of Sociology, and the Media School for co-sponsoring this. You know, as a last note, you can get the discount on the book. I should have posted that link at the beginning, but I will share it on social media, so you can follow me on Twitter or add me on Facebook, and you can get 20% off the book. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining us today. And yeah, Take care.
Thank you, Noah. Thanks, Koji.